Enjoy.
This week, the country remembered the lives of all those who experienced the tragedies of Hurricane Dorian last year. Hello and welcome to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. At this point last year, Bahamians everywhere were touched by the catastrophic damage done to the islands of Abaco and the footage that continued to come in. We were only left to wonder what was happening in Grand Bahama. Tonight, we climax our special on Dorian's devastation 1 year later. Stay tuned. Our conversation begins on the other side of this break.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts. And sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
And welcome back. You're watching On the Record, Dorian's devastation 1 year later. As we prepared for the landfall of Dorian, NEMA continued with their preparations as the lead agency for national disasters at the time. Few would have imagined what was really in store for us 1 year ago today. My guest for this portion of the show is the Director for the National Emergency Management Agency, Captain Stephen Russell. Captain Russell, welcome to On the Record.
Yes, good evening. My pleasure being here, Mr. Sawyer.
Great. We want to begin by talking about the functions of NEMA and how do they differ really from those of the Disaster Reconstruction Authority and other agencies like, let's say, the Red Cross, for example?
Again, NEMA, we're now officially a part of the National, the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, Management and Reconstruction, and an adjacent agency, the DRA. Again, our ministry, they're responsible for our policy directives. NEMA, we are tasked with ensuring that there's a plan of action in place to respond to any form of man-made or natural disasters. And we focus mainly on mitigation, preparedness, relief, and recovery. And the DRA, the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, their task is to focus on long-term recovery, medium and long-term recovery programs in the aftermath of disaster. Once an area has been declared a disaster zone, they would come into play to continue with the program moving forward in full recovery. That's the DRA. Again, we have a number of other partners, the Bahamas Red Cross and Salvation Army, and some other NGOs who also are partners with NEMA, are part of our overall mechanism to help us respond to persons who would be impacted in a disaster-stricken area.
Okay, and sort of walk us through a year ago when it seemingly was just NEMA at the helm of all of this as this hurricane was coming. What was different for you at that point, or was anything really different?
Yes, it was. The initial preparations, yes, we activated our program as necessary. We alerted our regional partners, that is the SEDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. We have partners in the Pacific Disaster Center. Likewise, some of our partner agencies, USAID, OFTA, we alert them as to the potential of what was coming our way. So our mechanisms were in place, our islands and the disaster committees were all on standby for what may have occurred. Again, we saw what happened, a devastating catastrophic storm that impacted the Abacos and the Grand Bahama Island. So that changed the game totally.
Now, once the storm hit, you were then charged with managing all of those agencies, all of your partners. How daunting of a task was that? You had so many people who were in need of help. We had islands in crisis. We were in a major disaster, and you had to coordinate all of these international agencies. What went into all of that?
Okay, initially, like I said, they really bombarded the NEMA's headquarters on the Gladstone Road. Scores and scores of persons came here to render some degree of assistance, trying to find out how they can get into the disaster zone, which is almost 100 miles away on two fronts, Abaco and Grand Bahama. But first of all, they had to come in through New Providence and had came in to check in with our agency. I had persons lying outside my door trying to get permission to go into the disaster area. Obviously, we had to find some alternate location to coordinate all of the NGOs that were coming offering their assistance. We had, first had to have them registered to make sure they're legitimate agencies. But we upped the National Training Center, and we set up an operation coordination center for NGOs so we can find out what they were bringing to the table, and we tried to link them, first of all, with the appropriate government agency or local NGO to enable them to carry their work. Again, one of the major challenges were, well, first of all, because the team in Abaco, the disaster committee in Abaco, they were all in distress. In fact, they were all basically evacuating the island. So in terms of who do we respond to, who could we connect with in the islands, that was a major challenge. So we had to quickly assemble a core team here in New Providence, and we had to ferry them into Abaco on a daily basis, got them in the day and brought them out in the afternoon, just to set up a core nuclear group. So when NGOs went into the islands, they had someone to connect with, first of all. So that was one of the key challenges we had to sift through, first of all, making sure there was a core team in Abaco that NGOs can link with once they sought to provide their assistance.
Captain Russell, you mentioned that you were bombarded with people wanting to help. In a situation like that, where so many agencies, so many individuals now want to get in and help, does that pose a danger, or does that pose a setback even to your work in trying to help those who are distressed and in need of help?
Well, at the time, yes, it was. We had persons from the airport, the Civil Aviation Authority. They were in NEMA. We had over 1,000 flights trying to get into Abaco. So again, we had to have them on board here in the office, having persons request approval to go into the disaster zone just to avoid any collision in the air. And immediately after the storm, we were on a full search and rescue mode. We had the Coast Guard and their assets who were trying to get in to assist with the evacuation program, but also in medical evacuation, search and rescue and recovery operations first. So every other relief efforts were secondary to search and rescue at the time. Again, so people just pressing, they wanted to get in. We had thousands of persons who were trying to get out of the disaster area as well, by aircraft or by boat, whatever means necessary. So it was a chaotic situation in the initial days immediately after the storm to get persons out, particularly those who need medical attention, and to get some initial relief supplies, to get responders into the islands who can provide some degree of order to what was going on the islands. Again, ground transportation was out because most of the vehicles were destroyed because of the flood from the surges. So that really restricted our ability to really respond to effectively coordinating a recovery effort, more so in Abaco, to a less extent in Grand Bahama.
And how then did you coordinate the relief supplies? What becomes priority, and who gets it? And also who's responsible for the distribution?
Well, again, the local disaster committees in the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama, we call a relief supply and distribution subcommittee, which is a part of our mechanism. Again, because the infrastructures in those subcommittees in Abaco and Grand Bahama were not in place, because the persons evacuating, again, we had to send persons into the areas. Fortunately, we had strong partners that came from World Food Program, USAID, OFTA, the Red Cross, and other agencies, SEDIMA. They brought the logistics persons in, and they set up a logistics hub in Abaco and Grand Bahama. So relief supplies that came through New Providence and that was sent into those disaster areas, they were able to receive them, put them in appropriate warehouses, catalog them, and they set up distribution centers across the length and breadth of those islands so that persons were able to gain access to needed food supplies and water, etc. So again, we have tremendous support from our international partners to help us with the relief supplies and distribution network on both islands.
Out of this disaster, did you learn some key things that you will implement in the event that we have another disaster? One in particular has to do with the distribution of supplies. People complained that they couldn't, it was days before they saw relief supplies, and understanding what we were facing. But is there anything that you can tell us definitively that we will do differently and better when that next disaster hits?
Yes, you can always plan, but you have to look at each scenario as they occur. Like I told you, first of all, in Abaco in particular, all the ground transportation were knocked out. We had to actually purchase some 30 vehicles and got into Grand Bahama and Abaco before we can get any movements across the island. We had to get security teams into the islands, local police, defense force, and soldiers from Trinidad and Jamaica, and regional police officers from Southeastern Caribbean countries, again, to establish law and order to prevent the looting on the islands before we could really, with full force, got relief supplies into the disaster-stricken areas. Again, we had to set up teams of volunteers, defense force personnel, again, to receive supplies, get them out to strategic locations in the islands so persons can gain access to them. It was a challenge to a certain extent. Again, in the future, particularly we have Keys and other places, we try to firm up arrangements with helicopter companies to get immediate relief supplies into some of the remote areas or areas that may be impassable due to a ground flooding. So again, we look at all these options as to how we can get relief supplies to impacted areas in a timely manner. Again, I'm dealing with... Sorry, go ahead.
Out of this, did you discover some deficiencies that you needed to address right away, that you said, immediately after, at first opportunity, we are going to address? And have they been addressed?
One key thing is, again, what we saw in Abaco in particular, or any other island that may be totally devastated, we need from the capital or from one of our adjacent islands have a core nuclear team that can go in to assist with the coordination of activities in the area. Again, likewise, logistics, we need to do a better job with our logistics. Within the first 3 or 4 days, I got a call from Tropical Shipping. Russell, we have 150 40-foot containers in Florida waiting to come into the country. So again, have the mechanism in place to officially receive these goods and then take them from containers, store them, and eventually get them into our distribution network. So some key things that we need we have been working on to try and improve on. Likewise, our information sharing and communications from a disaster-stricken area. We must be able to get immediate information out so we can share with our regional and international partners in terms of what our immediate needs are once they they make requests as to how they can best assist us. So information sharing as quickly as possible from a disaster-stricken area, and the coordination of the tons and tons of relief supplies that can come into the disaster area. Some may come through Nassau, some may fly directly into a disaster impacted area. So again, we must do a better job of coordinating that on the ground. But again, it all depends on which islands are impacted. If the infrastructure is impacted, whether the docks or harbors getting to from the docks is another thing. If the airports are impacted, these are all things that we try to find out, do an initial assessment to make sure our airports and our seaports are accessible to bring relief supplies in. And where there are blockages, we have to continue to find alternate means to get supplies to persons who would have been impacted.
Okay. My other question has to do with volunteers. There were so many people who were volunteering, who wanted to volunteer, but there was a lot of confusion about what's needed, where should I go, things of that nature. Have you given any thought to how do we coordinate volunteers?
Well, first of all, we try to ensure that all of our local disaster committees in the islands have a core group of volunteers in their respective islands. Okay, it's one thing for persons here in New Providence want to go into a disaster-stricken area to volunteer. Again, we've had major challenges with accommodations initially, even for the locals. And so responders going into the islands or volunteers, that is another challenge in finding adequate accommodations. But first of all, we encourage persons to register with the local disaster office. There is a subcommittee for volunteers. I just go and give the names, and to a certain extent, their skill sets that they can offer to the table if their services are required. So we encourage persons throughout the entire Bahamas, again, to liaison with your respective local disaster committees through the administrators, putting your name down that you'd like to volunteer. God forbid something occurs again in the future.
Outside of hurricanes, what kinds of disasters is NEMA also preparing for? Obviously, this is the thing that's always front of mind for us, but it's not the only thing that you have had to deal with and we will eventually deal with as a country. So what kinds of other emergencies and disasters are you prepared to deal with? And is that sort of an ongoing training situation?
And NEMA, again, we are a coordinating agency, and we plan to respond to any form of man-made and natural disasters, not just the hurricanes, but if you have aircraft mishaps, boating mishaps, oil spills, tornadoes, any form of major fires in communities. NEMA as a mechanism in all the islands, we will respond to an emergency. If you notice over the past 2 weeks, we had a plane that went down in the Treasure Key area. Once I was notified from the NAD department, I was able to make contact with the local island administrator in Central Abaco. And again, she mobilized a local team of volunteers, the RBDF, to respond to that down aircraft in the Treasure Key area. So again, once we get notified of any form of disaster emergencies anywhere throughout the Bahamas, we contact one another through whatever our communications means, and the local disaster committees are required to respond to those emergencies. So fires, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, boating mishaps, aircraft mishaps, major fires, those are things that we're planning and training for year-round.
And would you say that, throughout the islands, there is, I guess, equal training or equal availability of resources, or does it vary depending on how developed the island is, what the population is? Because I would think that a Grand Bahama and a Eleuthera may differ from an Acklins and a Maguana.
Most certainly, because of the populations, and if some islands are longer than the others, but we try to make sure that the essentials are in place based on some of the events that can occur. Over the past 5 years, we've been working on ensuring that all of the islands had floodwater rescue teams that have been trained in collaboration with our partners from the United States Dawn Command. We made sure they had basic firefighting teams and equipment in the islands. So these are some of the things that NEMA have been working on with our local disaster committees in the islands, and ensuring there's a local committee that can respond to any form of man-made and natural disasters. Again, all the islands differ. Grand Bahama and Abaco, more population-centered islands. Again, they need definitely more resources, but we're also mindful of what resources are in the country or in those islands. And we try to establish MOUs with a number of companies to make their resources available, whether trucks, boats, jet skis, so they're able to assist us with a response if necessary. And whether Bajo or Red Cross chapters, likewise, they're standing by to support any emergency or disaster events in the islands as first responders.
Dr. Nussel, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We know that the work of NEMA is enormous, and literally it never stops. I think people just think that you all come to work when there's a hurricane or during hurricane season, but it's important to note that you are at work year-round, preparing to respond to any disaster. So thank you very much for the work you do, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I'd say we have a fine team here at NEMA, and I'd like to say a thank you to the team here at NEMA, as well as members of the wider disaster committees here in New Providence, as well as throughout the Family Islands. Thank you very much for your efforts and your continued efforts moving forward. Thank you again.
Most definitely, yes. We do want to thank everybody involved. It certainly is a team effort, and we do know that the team there works very hard. So thank you very much. We appreciate you coming on and speaking with us. When On the Record continues, we will continue our conversation, of course, on Dorian's devastation 1 year later. Don't go anywhere.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
You're watching On the Record. This segment is made possible by Executive Printers. After assessing the damage Dorian had done to Grand Bahama and Abaco, the Disaster Reconstruction Authority was established under the Disaster Reconstruction Act of 2019. My guest for this portion of the show is the Managing Director of the DRA, Mrs. Catherine Smith. Okay, first of all, welcome again to On the Record. We are at probably one of the most historic anniversaries in the life of our country, and certainly not in a good way. This is the single largest disaster we faced, with multiple deaths and such widespread damage and destruction that we are still reeling from in many ways. I've got to start by asking, what has this week been like from your perspective? A lot of people have found themselves a year later emotionally in the same place, or in a different, close to where they were a year ago. But what has it been like, from your assessment, for the country 1 year later, as we reflect now on what took place a year ago?
Well, first, it's always nice to be on the show, Jerome, so I appreciate that. One of the things, I got a lot of calls this week as people were watching the various videos on social media, and some that were on television, of course. And people were saying, there are a lot of people who are still hurting, and a lot of people who are talking about what's going on. And I keep saying to people are not going to be satisfied with their lives until they are back 100% or close to it pre-Dorian. And I keep saying that you have to respect the fact that people want to express themselves, and they want to talk about all of the issues and all of the experiences that they experienced in Dorian. So for me this week, for me to listen to all of the many videos, and I've had so many phone calls as I go about in the community, people have been stopping and speaking just about what they had seen or heard this week. So I think this whole week has been very therapeutic, not just for the persons who have been impacted, but also for those persons who now can understand what people are going through in this country. So I think this week has been a good week. I know it's been a difficult week for people, but I think we all have to pause for a few minutes and just understand what people are going through. So I think that this week was a good week for expression and for people to feel and talk about their experiences.
In our first segment, we would have spoken with Captain Russell from NEMA and talked about the work of NEMA. And NEMA is just sort of, nowadays, NEMA is just one component in this whole disaster recovery, assessment, reconstruction. They're just one segment. I want us to talk about how the DRA now fits into this entire discussion. You've got a whole new ministry, and out of that ministry, the DRA was created. So help us again to understand where the DRA fits into this entire discussion.
Well, first of all, Jerome, I think I'd like to say that the Minister of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction, the Honorable Iram Lewis, along with his team, led by the Permanent Secretary Carl Smith, they are now looking, as we all are, looking at some new policies and framework to better understand the best way forward for the two agencies to work even closer. So I'm excited about that because I think as they look at this framework, it will inform the work of the DRA as well as NEMA, and it draws all of the talents within the organization to bear. And I think, first of all, that new framework that they are actually working on to make the ministry and the departments more efficient is a good thing. So that's underway. And we have had collaboration with the UNDP as well as the University of the West Indies. So that collaboration is also going to help really to make the ministry even more efficient. And so that is a good thing. As you know, I've tried to, people keep asking the question, really, what is the difference between the work that the two agencies are involved in? And as you know, NEMA, from your discussions with Captain Russell, NEMA has not changed. NEMA's role is hurricane preparedness, mitigation, early relief, early recovery. And they're responsible for training all around the country those persons who are called to action when a hurricane or a disaster happens. So NEMA's role does not change. The DRA, governed by a board, governed by some very strict board governance, is led by a chairman and a board of directors. And as the managing director, I basically act as the chief operating officer and drive the day-to-day work for the DRA. And so our work, we take over when it comes to what I call recovery 2. So for example, NEMA would have been involved in purchasing the domes. And what we are doing, because we have a full project management office, so what we do is we're about in the community making sure that those domes are erected. And you've heard much about that, the domes that are in Spring City, the domes that are now being erected on private properties. And in Grand Bahama, we have 40 domes that we will start the erection next week. We also have the donation from a donor who donated 20 by 20 modular container type houses, which will serve as temporary housing as well. So the DRA steps in, and because we have a project management office, we're responsible for those installation of those homes. And so we're really right on rebuilding and reconstruction. And so that's when our work starts.
So if you could take us to some of the areas and things that you are most pleased with that the DRA would have been able to achieve within these months since you've been established.
I think the first thing is we, through our small home repair program, we've been able to develop a database of all those homeowners who have been impacted by Dorian. And I think that moving forward, as we continue to grow this online program, we will have a program in place that if anything should happen, we are ready to go right away. And so a lot of things happened initially with the hurricane where people were signing up for services and benefits all over the place. And if we now have an online registration platform, particularly designed for persons who have experienced damages to their homes, now you can say, look, this is where you go, this is the sign up process. And so I think that's a good thing, because before we started, we did not have such a platform in place. And I think it's very frustrating to people when they have an issue and you're sending them all over the place, and everybody had such a traumatic experience because it was just a mess, quite frankly, after the hurricane, and so many people were all over the place. And so I think to be able to now put tools in place that we don't have to go through so much frustration, particularly with persons who are impacted, is a good thing. So I'm happy that we have this online tool, and we'll be able to also look at the data and the statistical information from the information we have and just be better informed in terms of what people's needs are. So we have that. I'm pleased about the debris cleanup in the communities. Of course, we will continue to have a situation where cleanup is continuous because people are repairing their homes at different levels and at different times. But we have to get the country, particularly the northern islands that have been impacted, we have to get the normal activity running back again. So you need normal municipal, operations to continue. We need local government to step in and do what they normally do in terms of cleanup and contracts that they issue on a normal basis. So I'm happy that, the cleanup has come a long way. I don't ever say it's done, because it cannot be done, because it's a continuous process. But I think for the most part, the majority of the hurricane debris is really what the focus has been. I'm also pleased now that we're at a point where we can start talking about rebuilding. So in the next coming weeks, we have meetings that we're planning, with town hall meetings with the community in Abaco, the community in Grand Bahama most affected. And we want to start talking about the 60-acre subdivisions that we are looking at. We want to talk about, get a feel from the communities. This is where we have an opportunity to construct a community center / hurricane shelter. Where do you think it's best suited for in your community? Because one of the things we have to do is we have to make sure that whatever we are doing within these disaster zones, it's part of the community as well. They have a lot to do with the success of rebuilding.
Okay, I've got to ask you this, because people look at progress sometimes in terms of time and not necessarily what they can see and touch. And people are going to ask, well, a year later, why are some of these discussions just happening? Why are you just now talking about rebuilding? Why are we just now talking about, building shelters? Shouldn't this have been done months ago? Why now is it just happening 1 year later, again, when we're in the midst of the hurricane season?
Well, the reality is this. The DRA was constituted in December. We began our work in earnest in January. After 6 weeks of being on the ground, we had to send all of our people home and to work from home because of COVID. So we were home from March to, I believe, probably the first week in June. And then we had other lockdowns between June and now. The country, thankfully, is starting to open up, domestically at least, and we're looking forward to what the competent authority says about the opening up internationally. So we've had some issues. Quite frankly, COVID-19 has been a real big issue. And I understand that, I understand how people feel about it, but when we started this work, we had to prioritize our work. And it doesn't make sense, Jerome, to be all over the place trying to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. What we wanted to do is you get the small home repair program up and running, because so many homes had been damaged. That system is working. It's probably next you had to say, well, before you rebuild, you got to clean up first, right? So I think that there is a systematic approach to the way the DRA has been working. And we developed those 7 priorities. I've gone over those with you before. We've developed those 7 priorities. But when you look at it 10 months later, you got to get people back in their homes. You got to get these schools open for kids to go back to school, even though now, due to COVID, a lot of the schooling is going to be virtual. And then you had to clean up the place, right? And that's an ongoing process. So I think for us, we had to come up with what are the priorities? What do we need to do first? Now we can begin the reconstruction and the rebuilding in earnest.
One of those priorities has been the small home repair program. Begin to, or help us to understand what you've been able to accomplish with that. How much money has been spent? How many homes, if you can, have been repaired, or how many people have benefited, so that people begin to understand what this program has done?
Well, first of all, to date, I think we have just under 5,000 people who've registered. However, everybody who registers, Jerome, do not receive help. Some people, after they go through the registration process, they don't meet the criteria for assistance. And that's a whole nother discussion, because for me, the insurance issue has been a big issue for people. So we can talk about that in a minute. So that's the first thing, because there is a criteria, right, in order to be able to receive assistance. And mostly you have to be Bahamian, you have to be a homeowner, and you have to have lived in your house, I believe, on August 31st, which would have been right before the hurricane. So there is a criteria, and we really have to follow some rules and regulations. Policies have to be put in place for the smooth running of any kind of program. Of those persons who have registered, as I said, not everybody meets the criteria, but there is also a process for receiving the funds. Nobody gets cash, first of all. We also have to make sure homes are assessed. Homes fall into 4 different categories: minor, medium, major, or destroyed. And then we issue purchase orders. Homeowners are asked to go and get quotes for whatever it is that they need. We have a control list of materials because the program is to make sure people would get their roofs fixed and close up their house first. So we have a control list of materials that can be purchased. We have a list of vendors that they can purchase from in Abaco and Grand Bahama. We have a list of contractors and builders that they can go to, because we've tried as best we could to recommend or to formulate a list of contractors and builders that have some kind of certification, that's been in the business, that have worked with people before. We do not pick contractors for people. We simply provide a list that we receive from the Ministry of Works, a list that we receive from the Grand Bahama Port Authority, and we develop a small builders list also as well, and there is some criteria that they have to meet. So that's really how the program works.
Okay. My other question now, of course, has to do with you said 5,000 up to date. About 5,000 people have registered. Not everybody meets the criteria. One of the areas has to do with insurance. What's the issue with those who have insurance who have not been able to qualify?
The problem is, when we started this program, if you had insurance as a homeowner and received proceeds from your insurance company, you would not qualify for this program. Some of the issues that have now come up with insurance is the fact that lending institutions have either, in some cases, taken the insurance proceeds and, according to homeowners, put it directly on their mortgages. So it means for them, the money went to pay off mortgages, or maybe brought mortgages up to date if they weren't. And so therefore they received no money to rebuild their home. And that is a big issue for a lot of people. And then there was also the issue of some people did have insurance, but the type of insurance that they had did not allow them to get any proceeds. Because if you had fire and this was a flood, obviously you weren't getting any insurance proceeds. So we are now talking with the board, and also, which we will discuss in our next board meeting, how do we address this issue of insurance? Because it cannot be right that if someone had insurance, but the insurance went to their mortgage, there must be some consideration, I suppose, for this program.
The home is damaged, and you haven't been able to do anything with it, having paid your insurance premiums. My other question before we go has to do also with the pledge conference. We had a pledge conference some months ago, and monies and resources were pledged to rebuilding, but we haven't heard much since then. Can you update us on what has happened to the monies and the resources pledged from that pledge conference?
Well, first of all, when we had the pledge conference in January, after the pledge conference, there was this news story that was put out that we had received 1.7, well, I think it said 1.5 billion in the news in monies from the pledge conference, right? But that was really not really accurate. What really happened was and after the pledge conference, we were able to go through each pledge. There were 49 pledges pledged that day, right? And so what really happened was people really gave grants, or they pledged equity financing opportunities, and that totaled that value. So if you look at 1.77 billion, and you look at one company that said that they were going to pledge 1.65 toward equity financing, which is the P3 group, and you take that from what was pledged, you realize that where's the cash? This cash is what I like to make sure people understand. There's no cash, right? And I think the way that the results of the pledge conference may have been brought forward made people believe that there was all this money, and but that really wasn't the case. Okay, so basically, and I keep repeating myself on this issue. Basically, when I looked at the cash that was pledged that day, it was $109,000, and I keep saying it. That's how much cash was pledged that day. Okay.
So what has happened to those things that were pledged? I mean, the cash and the other things, have they just sort of fallen off, gone to the wayside, or?
No, absolutely not. What we've done is, out of that pledge conference, there were about 7 countries that had made pledges. So some people made a pledge of $1 million towards mangrove restoration. What we've done is those pledges are being actively worked by and through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, country to country. So that's about those. But again, those pledges were very specific. And I keep repeating this fact too. As you talk to donors, donors have interests. And, you know, if someone is more interested in education and they want to pledge and give money towards a project in education, they're not going to give money towards debris cleanup or home repair, because that's not their interest. And so what we've spent the last several months doing is talking to each of these pledgees, trying to find out, first of all, if these pledges are still good. Some people we have been able to reach, others we have not. And we're actually matching donor money against projects. So we have some donors, for example, who are interested in putting money towards the community centers and hurricane shelters, okay? We're identifying, hopefully by October, 1 in Central Pines and 1 in Grand Bahama. And we're finalizing with the Port Authority the property for that in Grand Bahama. We pretty much know that the one for Abaco is to go in Central Pines. So we're now matching donor money with projects. They want to pay directly to the contractor or to the project. And that's basically what's happening. Very few donors want to give the cash to put into any government account. Some people are okay with that as long as it's not mixed up with any kind of administrative costs or anything. So the DRA has in fact opened an account for donations, and that account will only be used for donations to go specifically towards projects that donors want their projects to go to.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the update. Good news. Happy to hear that people are still donating, and these are going towards worthy causes and projects. Thank you very much. So stay with us. When we come back, we'll be joined by the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction. Stay with us.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record. Tonight we cover Dorian's devastation 1 year later. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer, and this segment is brought to you by the Grand Bahama Power Company. After the Prime Minister announced the formation of a new ministry that would be the lead of all national disaster management in the country, there was a lot of scrutiny surrounding that decision. He claimed this move would assist in ensuring that the red tape and bureaucratic roadblocks are cut through and removed. My guest for this portion of the show is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, Recovery and Reconstruction, Mr. Carl Smith. Mr. Smith, welcome to On the Record. 1 year post-Dorian, and let's start by dealing with the question of whether you've been able to effectively eliminate that bureaucracy and red tape that the Prime Minister spoke of when he established this ministry. And that was touted in removing all of the impediments in dealing with a catastrophe or an emergency.
Thank you, Jerome, for having me on the show once again. Let me give a backdrop Well, let me answer the question up front. That's an ongoing effort, and I think we are making progressive improvements. But the backdrop is this. The Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, Management, and Reconstruction is a ministry that is within the office of the Prime Minister. And the Minister of State, the Honorable Aaron Lewis, was appointed to assist the Prime Minister in the comprehensive disaster management agenda. That backdrop is necessary because the Office of the Prime Minister is responsible for the coordination of government. And disaster management, and in our case, it is comprehensive disaster management, which covers the full cycle of prevention, preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. To be successful in comprehensive disaster management requires a multidisciplinary and a multi-sectoral approach. That's the undertaking. And in the past, what would have happened, for example, after a disaster, we've had a culture really of responding and not dedicating, in my judgment, sufficient focus to prevention, to mitigation, and the whole gamut.
So this ministry, if I could, this ministry gives, in your estimation, gives more focus. And is this over a sustained period of time? Because normally we'd have hurricanes, there'd be repairs, and then sort of people would go back to their regular, day-to-day actions. You'd pull people from different ministries to come together for that purpose. But is this now more of a sustained focus, I guess, 24 hours, 365 days of the year?
It is to be a sustained focus. And one of the things we have spent time doing is developing a resilient recovery policy, a strategy, and an implementation plan for building resilience and effective recovery. So it's not an overnight thing. It is a sustained effort. When you look at government agencies across the board, for example, there used to be what was once called BEST. It is now the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection that focused on the environment, and the Ministry of Housing and Environment, and they looked at construction of houses, and in the construction of subdivision, as an example, proper planning has to go into that, and consideration taken of the environment, the climate in which we live. So we speak about sea level rising and what we're going to do to mitigate the effects of that. Those areas are covered across a broad stream or a number of ministries. So this intent, the decision by the government to establish the ministry is to coordinate those efforts, to bring all of the partners to the table, to articulate the strategy, which we have done. We have a draft strategy and an implementation plan. This is an ongoing effort because we live in an environment where we are faced by many hazards.
So if you could, what are some of the things that you can say outright that the ministry has been able to accomplish since its establishment by way of policy or by way of regulation, things that people can look at and say, okay, all right, I understand, or this is something that the ministry has tangibly done?
Okay, so as I've indicated, we have developed, and this has been in collaboration with our partners, the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, engaged on our behalf, consultants from the University of the West Indies. And they in turn worked with us being the whole range of ministries, NGOs, in articulating a resilient policy and in articulating a resilient recovery strategy and implementation plan. We are in receipt of the final draft of that, which should go to government for final approval. So it has been an ongoing process. And if I go back, typically an agency, whatever agency it is, it has a mandate, many of which is enshrined in law. And people guard that very closely. And we have had a tendency to operate in silos. So the ministry is not to take over the mandate of any other agency. As I indicated, it's enshrined in law. It is for us to collaborate. For example, if you're building a subdivision, you put up the houses, and then the houses require water, they require electricity, they require telecommunications. You don't want to have the house built and you don't have all of those other facilities in place. So those agencies need to collaborate. And it's the same thing that's going on now with the recovery effort. So houses are being repaired, then they have to wait for electricity to come in, for water to come in. And when you have a delays in those areas, you have frustration. So it is very important for the various agencies to work together. And it takes an entity to do that, to facilitate that. It just happens to be the ministry under which NEMA and the DRA falls. So the DRA is responsible, as you would know, for the recovery effort, for the reconstruction effort.
Mr. Smith, one of the biggest criticisms that we have heard, people are particularly on those islands and even in the Keys, we haven't seen government agencies. We see NGOs, and they are the ones helping us. But people continue to say that they have not seen or felt the presence of government. How do you respond to those kinds of assertions and accusations?
Well, the NGOs that are on the ground are there because of approval that they would have received from the government to be in the country in the first instance. All of these agencies, or most of them certainly, are working hand in hand with the government. So for example, in the reconstruction of homes, you'll have an NGO that would provide the building materials, and the government will pay the workers, the laborers for their work. In the case right now, what we are doing, we are outfitting some additional places to serve as shelters, and the U.S. government is providing the materials to do that. So it's a collaborative effort. Now, I guess you can say you're not going to see anybody, not necessarily, persons out there with a DRA shirt or emblem or NEMA. The same thing happened right after the hurricane. Nobody saw anybody from NEMA. Well, persons from NEMA are there, and we recognize that. And going forward, I suppose we could have emblems identifying who is engaged directly with NEMA, as you would see, for example, with the Red Cross. But it is not true to say that the government has not been on the ground. The government has worked hand in hand with international organizations, NGOs, in this effort. It's a collaborative effort.
Sure. My final question as we prepare to wrap up this segment, unfortunately we're out of time, but the truth is we are still within the hurricane season. We are in the hurricane belt, and we all worry, how prepared are we should another storm arise? Are we any better prepared? Are we any better off in terms of preparation and response a year later since Dorian?
I think so. But we are now facing also COVID. So that presents additional challenges in terms of even the recovery effort with the reconstruction and having to, as best we can, observe social distancing and wearing of masks. And of course, in our climate, it's a challenge. And of course, with sheltering, we have had to find additional places to provide sheltering because we need also to put in place social distancing in the shelter facilities. But, it's an ongoing work. It never stops. We don't know what might come our way. We pray that nothing comes. But I am satisfied. I am truly satisfied that given the resources at our disposal, we've done the best we can to prepare for and to respond to an event. Just yesterday, we completed an exercise which was to test new systems that we've put in place since Dorian, and things are going well. So, and we've had to do that because a lot of the response will have to be done virtually. Mm-hmm. So, I think we have made significant improvements, and the only way you can know that for sure is if we have an event, and we pray God that we don't have an event. Yes. But it's an ongoing effort. And, I guess the public has to understand, public servants, as far as I know, they don't go out of their way to make life difficult for the public. I would admit that we need perhaps better interaction with the public. And we would do our best, because whatever happens affects us all. Right now, as we're dealing with the COVID situation, we, NEMA and the ministry, working hand in hand with the Ministry of Health, we do our best with the resources at our disposal, and we're open to the public to provide their input and suggestions. But when you put all of the mix together, and the decision has to be made, and we are in a position where we have the full mix of things, we make the best decision that we can in the interest of the majority of the people.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us today. We do know that this is a difficult and a long work, so we thank you for coming and sharing some of the progress that you are making. So again, thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the coverage and the information sharing that you provide to the public.
Thank you.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
That's going to do it for tonight's episode of On the Record. Dorian's devastation 1 year later. Special thanks to all of my guests, Captain Stephen Russell, Catherine Smith, and Carl Smith. Special thanks to my production and technical teams as well. And to our viewers, thanks again for watching week after week. That's going to do it for our program. We'll see you next time, same place, right here on The Record.